Hey everyone, this is Ben with Astronomer, and today we're going to go over how to pull some data from Salesforce, stage that data in a S3 bucket, and then pour copy over that data, pulling it from S3 into Amazon Redshift. So to start out, we're just going to look at our Python code here, which is really what our pipeline will be made out of because we're working within Airflow. And we're just going to import datetime and time delta from the datetime library, and then import from the Airflow library a DAG definition. So we're just going to set some default arguments here, setting the owner to just be the system level Airflow. We do not want to do a backfill today. We're just going to be pulling in records all at once, and then set our start date, set the email in case we want to email on failure or retry. In this case, we don't care about a failure or retry email because we're just going to be testing this out. But if we wanted to run this in production, we definitely would want to make sure that we had a notification system set up in case there were any issues. If any of these tasks fail, we want them to just retry once and do that on a 5-minute interval in case the reason they're failing has to do with a API rate limiting on Salesforce's end. The retry delay will allow hopefully that system to recover and us to skirt that limit. So we have our DAG here. We're just going to name it Salesforce to Redshift. We're going to assign it the default arguments that we just defined up here. Set the schedule interval to be once. We can also set that to be something defined in cron tab if we want to get a little more granular in how the schedule runs on, or we want to make sure specifically that it doesn't conflict in time-wise with another DAG that might be running. But for now, we're just going to set it to be once because we just are testing it right now. And again, we don't want to do a backfill, so we're going to set catch-up equal to false. So we have our basic code here. This is really all we need to get started with our DAG. And we can see over here that the DAG is in our Airflow console. There's an error getting thrown, no tasks are found. That's expected because all we've done right now is just define what the DAG is. We haven't actually assigned anything to it. We can do that by just going back here, importing a dummy operator from the Airflow library, and then assigning it the name kickoff DAG, assigning it to the DAG that we defined up here so that this task knows which DAG to associate with, and then we refresh the page and there we go. There's kickoff DAG. So what is a dummy operator? Dummy operator, as Airflow's docs describe it, does literally nothing. So it's just something that you can put in here to test with, but also to group DAGs in case you want to keep it a downstream task from any group of upstream tasks to make sure that it only kicks off if all of them succeed. That's a little more advanced for what we're going to be talking about today, so we're going to skip that. Please reach out if there's any questions on that, or you'd like to see a tutorial more in depth on dummy operators. So to start out, we've got a dummy operator. We've shown that we can associate operators with a DAG, and actually once a operator is instantiated, it becomes a task. So you can see here it has the task ID kickoff DAG. The operator, you can think of operators being really more like Mad Libs to tasks, that they're really just templates waiting for the appropriate parameters to know how to function. In this case, the kickoff DAG only really needs a name and which DAG to associate with for it to work, so it's pretty simple. But that's not really interesting, so we're going to go down here and we're going to actually start working with some APIs. So the first thing we need to do for that is set up our connections. So here, we're just importing a few libraries, connection, provide session, the S3 hook, and the Salesforce hook. And what that's going to allow us to do is access some of the connections that we've previously set in our connections panel. So Amazon S3, or Astronomer S3, Astronomer SFDC. What this allows us to do is make sure that all of our credentials are kept in a single encrypted location, so that as we're building more pipelines and as we're accessing the same keys, API keys, passwords over and over again, we don't need to pull that directly into our code. We can just reference it here And so even though we don't actually pull in the API keys and passwords, we still get to use them. So now that we have that, let's define out which Salesforce objects we want to access. And then down here, we're going to actually build out our logic that pulls in the Salesforce data that we need to get started. So here, we are defining a Python operator. We're assigning it the name get name fields, and here the name is one of these. So it would works out to be get account fields, get contact fields, etc. And then we define the Python callable get Salesforce fields here, and then associate that with the operator, the Python operator SFDC fields. So what that does when we go back, we refresh that, we now have a much more complex DAG with not too much code being written. And what this is going to do is hit the Salesforce API and pull the appropriate fields for each one of these objects. So Salesforce uses a language called SOQL, so Salesforce Object Query Language. So if you want to get all the data for Salesforce object, like your contacts, you're going to have to first acquire the fields to build the query to tell Salesforce what fields for your contact records you want. In our case, we want all of them, so we're just going to use the Salesforce hook that comes with Airflow and say get available fields and pass in the name that we set here. So it's going to say get the available fields for contacts, tasks, campaigns, leads, and then it will return those as an XCOM, and an XCOM is just data that's available for other tasks to pull from, and we'll pass that into the next task that we have in line, which is where we'll actually get our records. But first I want to talk about this little bitwise operator here, which is how we associate our tasks, and we have them say, make sure that these are downstream of the kickoff DAG. So kickoff DAG here, bitwise operator, SFDC fields, and that's all we need to do to create this nice looking DAG. So that gives us our fields, but that's not all that we want. What we really want is the records. So for that, we're going to do another Python operator, make a new task called get Salesforce, or called SFDC records, and we're going to assign it the Python callable, the Python function get Salesforce records. So here again, we're pulling in our credentials from our connections. So our API keys, our usernames and passwords, we don't need to reference them directly because they're kept in Airflow. And we write out all of the logic that we need to be able to extract the data we need and then output it in a nice JSON file to S3. So here we're also pointing the S3 hooks, which has our AWS credentials. We're loading using the load file method for the S3 hook. And then we close our connection and return the S3 key. That's really all we need to do to pull all of our Salesforce records, organize them into a structure that allows us to then copy into Redshift, and then just write that file to S3. So if we go back and save the file, and go up here, refresh the page. Whoops. Forgot one last thing. We do want to actually make sure that we are keeping track of our DAG as it occurs. So I'm actually going to add in a couple Slack notifications here. So after our Salesforce data gets into S3, we want a notification to hit our Slack, and then after the records get into Redshift, we're going to want that to happen as well. So let's just refresh that. And that error is gone. So here we go. So now we have the kickoff DAG going to get fields, get records, and then a Slack letting us know that the records have succeeded. I commented out this a bit early, and it kind of looks out of place. I'm just going to just comment that, and then that one goes away. So we now have our kickoff tag leading to a bunch of field requests, then a record requests, a Slack notification letting us know that they've all succeeded and all the data is in S3. And then we want to import that data into Redshift. So that's done with a pretty simple copy command here. We're just going to be copying into a scheme called Salesforce Raw, and then passing the name so that the file name that we previously wrote to S3 comes through as a new table in Redshift. So again, down here, we are using our S3 connections for our credentials in the copy command. We don't need to get our S3 credentials again because we've already retrieved them from our database. And then down here, we are just using more bitwise operators to make sure that the order stays clean. So if we refresh this now, we have our kickoff tag, get Salesforce fields, use those fields to get the appropriate records, let us know that these records have successfully made it to S3, import this data into Redshift, and then send me a notification that the records have successfully made it to Redshift. So in just under 200 lines of code, we have done a pretty complex DAG. And what's really cool about this is that this could be, this doesn't need to be 10, it could just be one object. We refresh this, one object. It could be 5 objects. We're using 10 because that's what we care about, but it could very well be something much larger. So if we had 100, we could easily do 100. The logic's the same. There's really very little work involved. So that was pretty easy, but let's see if we can make it even easier. So for that, we're actually going to look at a operator that we adapted from a open source Salesforce operator. And what this is going to do is allow us to take this about 50 lines of code, everything from really here down to here, so just about 104 to 156, and squash that down just into this. And so what this is a way. What this is a Salesforce to S3 operator, and that's a way of really just saving reusable code. So that's this file right here, it's the Salesforce operator, and that allows us to just set the variables that we know are going to be changing. So what's the name going to be? What Salesforce connection do we want to use? What S3 connection do we want to use? What S3 bucket do we want to access? And what should be the output name and format? So we can eliminate a pretty good chunk of code and get really the same functionality. So if we look over here, Salesforce to Redshift, it looks basically the same, although over here you just have the Salesforce name to S3, whereas in our previous DAG you had fields leading into records. So all of this is really just squashed into one operation here. So it's a lot easier to use, a lot cleaner, requires less code to be written the next time around, and it's a bit faster because it's happening in one task versus two. So that's pretty much it for the Salesforce to Redshift tutorial. If you have any questions, please reach out to any of the team members at Astronomer. We have a helpful humans at astronomer.io email address, which we all check and are happy to answer any of your questions. So thank you again, and please reach out. Thank you.